Mining potash for hours, thousands of feet underground, is sometimes thought of as a dangerous job, but new technology is changing that perception. Janella Hamilton reports from the nutrient Corey potash mine.
Today, as supply chains falter and food prices climb, potash has become far more than an industrial input. It has become leverage, political, economic, and strategic. Canada, holding nearly 40% of the global supply, finds itself in possession of a resource that nations cannot afford to ignore. And in a world where food has become power, potash is transforming into something far greater than fertilizer. It is a weapon that can reshape trade relations, even with its closest allies. The United States is the prime example of this dependency. For decades, American farmers from Iowa to Nebraska have relied on Saskatchewan's potash to fuel their harvests. While the U.S. produces a fraction of its own needs, barely 400,000 tons a year, it consumes more than 5 million tons annually. That gap is filled almost entirely by Canada. This imbalance creates a reality Washington cannot ignore. When Canada controls the flow of potash, it controls the stability of American food production itself. So, when former President Trump imposed a sweeping 35% tariff on Canadian goods, the headlines focused on cars, steel, and aluminum. Yet beneath those stories was a much bigger, more explosive truth: potash. Unlike cars or steel, potash is not optional. If Ottawa were ever to halt shipments or even reduce exports, the shock wouldn't just ripple through markets, it would strike at the very core of the U.S. food chain. Rising costs, shrinking harvests, and food insecurity would follow. Canada knows this, Washington knows this, and that is why potash is no ordinary commodity. It is leverage. When Trump signed his tariff order and followed it with a public threat to Prime Minister Mark Carney, the world expected retaliation. But instead of fiery speeches or headline-grabbing countermeasures, Carney chose silence, not weakness, but strategy. While Washington thundered, Ottawa quietly adjusted, postponing digital taxes on U.S. tech giants, extending cooperation on border issues, and sending signals too subtle for headlines but loud enough for diplomats. It was silence as strategy, a refusal to play America's game on America's terms. But silence has its risks. Within Canada, frustration began to mount. Lawmakers, economists, and business leaders all echoed the same question. If America plays with tariffs, what is Canada's answer? The longer Ottawa stayed quiet, the louder the domestic pressure grew. Carney's gamble depended on patience, but patience wears thin when livelihoods hang in the balance. Could potash, hidden beneath Saskatchewan's soil, be the quiet move Canada was holding back? Was the pink mineral destined to step onto the world stage, not just as fertilizer, but as a geopolitical weapon? In truth, potash has already crossed that line. According to the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, over half of global food production depends on fertilizers. And within fertilizers, potassium, potash's essential element, is irreplaceable. Without it, crops weaken, yields shrink, and food shortages erupt. Canada, with its vast 1.1 billion tons of reserves, controls the flow of this silent but mighty resource. A mineral that once stayed underground is now standing tall in the geopolitics of food and survival. And potash is not Canada's only quiet weapon. While tariffs dominated headlines, Canada was redrawing the energy map. Projects like the $40 billion LNG development in British Columbia symbolized a seismic shift. With ships carrying liquefied natural gas directly to Asia, half the transit time of American shipments, Canada is positioning itself as a global energy player independent of U.S. influence. Pipelines, ports, and corridors are not just infrastructure. They are exits from dependency and entries into global influence. Even in industries targeted by tariffs, Canada has flipped the script. When U.S. steel tariffs threatened Canadian jobs, Ottawa didn't retaliate with more tariffs. It rebuilt. Billions were poured into modernizing the steel industry with cleaner, more efficient technology. Public projects were mandated to use Canadian steel, securing domestic value chains. Workers received retraining and support. Businesses gained credit relief, and the industry was restructured not for today, but for decades to come. The message was clear. Canada doesn't play tit for tat. It rewrites the rules of the game. And so, Canada's response to American tariffs is not bluster, but blueprint. Instead of dramatic rhetoric, Ottawa has chosen quiet strategy, long-term investment, and diversification. The U.S. is no longer the center of Canada's trade. It is one part of a larger, more balanced picture. In a world consumed by chaos and confrontation, Canada is betting on stability as its greatest asset. Carney's leadership is not about shouting louder, but about building smarter. And perhaps, in a time when the world equates noise with power, true strength lies in the silence that reshapes the future.